Have you ever noticed that far-away look in the eyes of a man who smiles but isn't really present? Carl Jung, the revolutionary Swiss psychoanalyst, discovered that behind this social mask there is a universe of silent pain that few can recognize. Society has taught men to bury their emotional wounds so deeply that they often can't name them themselves. When a man is emotionally broken, he doesn't cry out for help. Instead, his fragmented psyche communicates through specific behavioral codes, signals that Jung identified as manifestations of the wounded masculine. These behaviors are like cracks in a seemingly solid wall, revealing internal, structural collapse that few are willing to admit. What happens when the shadow, that repressed part of the personality that Jung studied so much, begins to consume the light of a man's consciousness? How to identify when male stoic suffering has exceeded the limit of what is bearable? In what ways do the ancestral archetypes that inhabit our collective unconscious influence the way men process or fail to process their deepest emotional pain? In this video, we'll unravel the 6 telltale signs Jung identified in emotionally broken men. Behaviors that are often misinterpreted as personality traits, when in fact they're the silent cries of a conflicted soul. Get ready for a journey through the hidden layers of male vulnerability, where the unspoken speaks louder than any verbal confession. You will never look at male silence in the same way again. 1. Dominant shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow represents everything that we repress, deny, and hide from ourselves and others. When a man is emotionally broken, his shadow does not remain contained in the basements of the unconscious. It overflows, dominating significant aspects of his conscious life. Jung observed that this phenomenon occurs when the male ego, weakened by unprocessed emotional traumas, loses its ability to maintain psychic balance. A man with the dominant shadow exhibits seemingly contradictory behaviors. He may be extremely critical of the same faults in others that he secretly possesses, but he is unable to recognize in himself. This projection, as Jung called it, is an unconscious defense mechanism that allows the emotionally broken man to transfer outward what he cannot face internally. He sees in others the negative qualities that he cannot bear to admit in his own personality. The dominance of the shadow also manifests itself through disproportionate emotional outbursts. Every day, situations that would normally cause only mild irritation can trigger intense and seemingly inexplicable reactions. This is because, according to Jung, the repressed psychic energy does not disappear. It accumulates in the unconscious until it finds an escape valve, often inappropriate to the context. What we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as destiny, Jung wrote. This observation applies perfectly to the man whose shadow has dominated his psyche. He becomes a victim of repetitive, self-destructive patterns without understanding their origin. Failed relationships, recurring professional conflicts, and constant self-sabotage are manifestations of this fate that Jung identified as the non-integrated. Shadow acting autonomously. Another telltale sign is the development of a rigid and one-sided personality. The emotionally broken man often clings to an idealized, inflexible version of himself, a persona in Jungian vocabulary that serves as a shield against his vulnerabilities. This psychological rigidity, however, only strengthens the shadow, creating a vicious cycle where the more he tries to deny his dark aspects, the more these aspects gain power over his behavior. The dominant shadow also manifests itself through disturbing and recurring dreams. Jung paid special attention to the dream life of his patients, considering it a direct window into the unconscious. An emotionally broken man often reports nightmares where he is stalked, threatened, or commits acts that he would consciously never consider. These dreams are attempts by the psyche to communicate the internal imbalance that the conscious refuses to acknowledge. The relationship with one's own body also undergoes significant changes. Jung noted that the dissociation between consciousness and shadow often manifests as dissociation between mind and body. Men may neglect their physical health, ignore signs of burnout, or, paradoxically, become obsessive about body control through extreme exercise regimens or restrictive diets. In both cases, the body becomes a battlefield where the internal psychic conflict materializes. 2. Anima ferida. In Jungian psychology, the anima represents the unconscious feminine principle present in the male psyche. Jung identified this archetype as the inner counterpart that balances the male's predominantly male consciousness. When a man is emotionally broken, his anima often finds itself wounded, distorted, or repressed, creating a deep imbalance that affects all of his relationships, especially with the feminine. The wounded anima manifests itself primarily in the way men relate to women. Jung observed that emotionally broken men tend to oscillate between two dysfunctional extremes: excessive idealization or constant devaluation of the feminine. In the first case, the man projects his non-integrated anima onto external female figures, transforming them into unattainable goddesses or mythical saviors. This unconscious projection creates impossible expectations that inevitably lead to disillusionment. In the second case, the man rejects and devalues the feminine as a way of denying his own internal feminine qualities that he considers unacceptable: sensitivity, vulnerability, receptivity. The encounter with anima is a test of male courage. Jung wrote, "A man with a wounded anima demonstrates profound difficulty in accessing and expressing emotions. Sensitivity, culturally associated with the feminine, becomes forbidden territory. He may develop extremely limited emotional language, unable to name feelings beyond anger or satisfaction. This emotional poverty is not just a matter of vocabulary, but reflects a real inability to recognize effective nuances within oneself." Jung saw in this limitation a clear sign of the repressed anima. Creativity also suffers significant impacts. Jung considered the anima to be a vital source of creative inspiration, intuition, and connection with the collective unconscious. When wounded, man experiences persistent creative blocks, or paradoxically, a chaotic and self-destructive creativity. Artists with a wounded anima often produce works that reflect their internal fragmentation, beautiful, yet charged with unprocessed angst. A man's dreams of a wounded anima often feature threatening, seductive, or unapproachable female figures. Jung paid special attention to these dreams, considering them direct communications from the unconscious about the state of man's relationship with his inner feminine principle. Recurring nightmares involving women abandoning, cheating, or attacking the dreamer are clear signs of an anima in distress. Sexuality also reveals the condition of anima. An emotionally broken man may develop a dysfunctional relationship with his sexuality, oscillating between periods of sexual compulsion and phases of complete aversion to intimacy. Jung observed that these fluctuations reflect the unstable relationship with the inner anima. Sexuality, rather than an expression of intimate connection, becomes a battleground where conflict with the inner feminine manifests itself. Another telltale sign is difficulty maintaining long-lasting intimate relationships. The man with the wounded anima often repeats dysfunctional patterns, attracting and being attracted to partners who mirror his unresolved internal conflict. Jung called this phenomenon negative synchronicity, an external manifestation of internal psychic imbalance. Relationships that begin with intense idealization often end in deep disillusionment, in a cycle that repeats itself until the wound in the anima is recognized and treated. The relationship with her own mother, or with the internalized maternal image, also reveals the state of anima. Jung identified that emotionally broken men often carry unresolved maternal complexes that contaminate their relationship with the feminine in general. Whether due to an overly dependent bond or a traumatic breakup, the mother figure remains a powerful and often unconscious influence on how a man relates to his own anima. 3. Deep isolation. The isolation that Carl Jung identified in emotionally broken men goes far beyond simple physical withdrawal. It is a multi-dimensional phenomenon that he described as a loneliness within one's own soul. This profound isolation represents a disconnection not only from others, but also from significant parts of oneself. A withdrawal from life that occurs in progressive layers and often imperceptible to man himself. On the surface, it manifests itself as a gradual distancing from social relations. Man begins to decline invitations, reduce interactions, and build a fortress of solitary routines. Jung noted that this movement is rarely abrupt or dramatic. Rather, it develops subtly, often rationalized as a need for space or a preference for solitude. Unlike healthy introversion, which Jung valued as a source of psychic energy, this isolation has a compulsive and defensive quality, serving as a shield against emotional vulnerabilities perceived as unbearable. Modern man does not understand how much his rationalism has taken him away from his deepest nature and impaired him in his individuality, Jung wrote. This observation illuminates a second dimension of isolation: disconnection from one's own instinctual nature. The emotionally broken man often develops an alienated relationship with his body and its basic needs. It may neglect sleep, proper nutrition, or physical movement, treating the body as a machine separate from its essential identity. This dissociation between mind and body, which Jung considered particularly prevalent in modern Western culture, intensifies the feeling of internal fragmentation. More deeply, there is an isolation from one's own feelings. Jung observed that emotionally wounded men develop sophisticated mechanisms to avoid contact with their authentic emotions. They can over-intellectualize their experiences, turning feelings into abstract concepts that are easier to control. This tyranny of the intellect, as Jung called it, creates a barrier between man and his genuine emotional life. He may be able to theoretically analyze his problems with impressive lucidity, but he remains unable to feel and process the emotions associated with them. Isolation also manifests itself through what Jung called the loss of the religious function of the psyche, not necessarily in the confessional sense, but as a disconnection from the sense of meaning and transcendent purpose. The emotionally broken man often reports a persistent sense of existential emptiness, an inability to find authentic meaning even in objective achievements. Jung considered this spiritual dimension of isolation particularly devastating, as it deprives man of the symbolic resources necessary to process and integrate his suffering. Intimate relationships, when they exist, reveal another aspect of deep isolation. Jung noted the paradoxical phenomenon of loneliness for two, men who maintain relationships where they are physically present but emotionally absent. These men develop a remarkable ability to hold superficial conversations while completely concealing their inner world. Partners often report feeling like they never really meet these men, even after years of living together. This absent presence represents a sophisticated form of isolation that preserves the appearance of connection while keeping the authentic self inaccessible. Work, paradoxically, becomes both a symptom and a refuge of this isolation. Jung noticed that emotionally broken men often compulsively immerse themselves in professional activities, using hyper-performance as an escape mechanism. This work addiction provides both a socially acceptable justification for isolation and a distraction from unprocessed emotions. Man can construct an identity entirely based on external achievements, while his inner world remains an unexplored and feared territory. Dreams of men in deep isolation often contain images of imprisonment, dead-end labyrinths, or desolate territories. Jung paid special attention to these dream symbols, considering them direct representations of the state of the psyche. Particularly significant are the figures of wild men, or hermits, that appear in these dreams, archetypal depictions of isolation that may contain both the danger of complete alienation and the potential for a transformative reconnection with neglected aspects of the self. 4. Veiled self-destructiveness. The self-destructiveness that Carl Jung identified in emotionally broken men rarely presents itself in an obvious or direct way. Rather, it manifests itself through subtle and often disguised patterns that man himself does not recognize as harmful. Jung called this phenomenon the unconscious sacrifice of the self, a gradual process of self-sabotage that occurs below the threshold of consciousness, but which systematically undermines well-being and psychic development. The first sign of this veiled self-destructiveness appears in the relationship with one's own body. Jung observed that emotionally wounded men often develop what he called selective somatic neglect, a pattern of ignoring specific bodily cues while possibly being extremely attentive to others. An executive may obsessively monitor their physical performance levels in the gym while completely ignoring signs of chronic burnout or debilitating muscle tension. This selective dissociation allows the body to absorb the impact of unrecognized psychological distress, manifesting it through physical symptoms that are treated as inconveniences separate from mental health. The body pays the price of the lies that the mind tells itself, Jung wrote in his clinical observations. This psychosomatic perspective reveals how conditions such as chronic insomnia, persistent digestive disorders, or unexplained muscle aches often represent physical manifestations of unresolved psychic conflicts. The emotionally broken man may consult multiple specialists for these symptoms without ever addressing their true origin. The unconscious self-destructiveness that Jung identified as an expression of the fragmented psyche. In relationships, veiled self-destructiveness manifests itself through what Jung called patterns of relational sabotage. The man repeatedly chooses incompatible partners or dynamically recreates the same conflicts in different relationships. Even more telling is the timing of this sabotage. Jung noted that it often occurs precisely when the relationship begins to offer genuine possibilities for intimacy and healing. This fear of relational success reflects a profound paradox. Man simultaneously seeks and fears the connection that could help restore his emotional integrity. Professionally, veiled self-destructiveness appears in what Jung described as self-defeating success, a pattern where a man achieves positions or achievements that he secretly does not want or for which he is not emotionally prepared. You may accept promotions that take you away from jobs you genuinely value, or build entire careers in fields that don't resonate with your true inclinations. Jung observed that these men often reported dreams where they were lost in huge buildings or wearing clothes that did not fit them, symbols of the misalignment between their outer path and their authentic inner needs. The relationship with substances reveals another dimension of this self-destructiveness. Jung was one of the first psychologists to recognize that alcohol and other substance abuse often represents a form of self-medication for unrecognized emotional pain. The emotionally broken man may develop what Jung called functional dependencies, patterns of views that remain socially acceptable and do not drastically interfere with everyday functioning, but which systematically dull emotional awareness. Particularly revealing is the context of this use. Jung noted that it often intensifies in moments of potential growth or confrontation with repressed aspects of the self. The relationship with money and material resources can also manifest veiled self-destructiveness. Jung observed patterns of financial self-sabotage, where men repeatedly make decisions that compromise their material security despite possessing knowledge and the ability to act differently. These patterns often reflect unconscious beliefs about worthiness and personal worth. A man may work tirelessly to build wealth, only to lose it through impulsive decisions or negligence, in a cycle that Jung identified as an outward expression of an unresolved internal conflict over self-worth. Perhaps the most subtle aspect of veiled self-destructiveness is what Jung called systematic growth avoidance. The emotionally broken man develops sophisticated mechanisms to avoid situations, relationships, or insights that could catalyze genuine psychic transformation. This resistance to growth does not manifest itself as outright rejection, but as a series of postponements, distractions, and rationalizations that effectively maintain the psychological status quo. Jung observed that these men often surround themselves with people who strengthen their defenses and avoid those who might challenge them constructively. The dreams of these men often contain images of symbolic self-mutilation, accidents, or situations, where the dreamer passively observes his own danger without intervening. Jung considered these dreams to be direct communications from the unconscious about the unrecognized self-destructiveness in waking life. Particularly significant are recurring dreams where the man is unable to speak, scream, or call for help. In dangerous situations, accurate representations of the inability to recognize and express his own need for emotional support. 5. Anger displaced. Anger in Jungian psychology is not inherently negative. It represents a vital psychic energy that, when consciously integrated, can catalyze transformation and establish healthy boundaries. However, Carl Jung observed that in emotionally broken men, this energy rarely finds direct and constructive expression. Instead, it manifests itself through what he called affective displacement, a process where emotion is redirected from its original source to substitute targets, often inappropriate or disproportionate. The first sign of this displacement appears in the apparently exaggerated reactions to small, everyday frustrations. Jung noticed that men with misplaced anger can react disproportionately to trivial inconveniences, a traffic jam, a lost object, a small technological glitch. This micro-explosiveness, as Jung described it, represents a leak of accumulated emotional pressure that does not find adequate channels of expression. Man may experience these reactions as completely justified at the time, unable to perceive the disconnect between the external stimulus and the intensity of his emotional response. Unexpressed anger is like a dammed river. It eventually overflows or finds new, often destructive paths, Jung wrote in his clinical observations. This hydraulic metaphor illustrates how unprocessed emotional energy inevitably seeks expression, even if indirect. One telling pattern is what Jung called hierarchical displacement, where anger originating in relationships where man feels powerless with superiors, institutions, or authority figures, is redirected to contexts where he has greater control or power. The boss who cannot confront his own superior may unconsciously transfer this frustration to subordinates. The man who feels socially diminished can displace this anger to the family environment. Particularly significant is the bodily manifestation of this displaced anger. Jung was a pioneer in recognizing the somatization of repressed emotions, noting how unexpressed anger often manifests itself through chronic muscle tension, especially in the jaw, neck, and shoulder region. This body armor, as Jung called it, a concept later developed by his contemporary Wilhelm Reich, represents a physical containment of emotional energy. The body literally holds the anger that the mind refuses to acknowledge, creating patterns of tension that can eventually lead to conditions such as bruxism, tension migraines, or chronic musculoskeletal problems. In verbal communication, misplaced anger manifests itself through what Jung called chronic passive aggressiveness, a pattern where hostility is expressed indirectly through sarcasm, veiled criticism, punitive silences, or caustic humor. This form of communication allows the emotionally broken man to express anger while maintaining the illusion of control and civility. When confronted about these indirect expressions, he often responds with genuine surprise or denial. "I'm just joking," or "You're being too sensitive," demonstrating the profound dissociation between his conscious experience and the emotional content he conveys. Intimate relationships reveal another aspect of anger displaced through what Jung identified as patterns of passive sabotage. Men may systematically fail to meet commitments, forget important responsibilities, or create subtle obstacles to relational well-being, all while maintaining a facade of commitment. This indirect expression of anger is particularly destructive because it resists direct confrontation. Each isolated incident can be explained as carelessness or circumstance, while the cumulative pattern reveals a consistent displacement of unacknowledged hostility. Jung noted that displaced anger often finds expression through surrogate obsessions, intense fixations on issues, causes, or activities that, while possibly legitimate in themselves, function as repositories for unprocessed emotional energy. A man may develop obsessive preoccupation with distant social injustices while remaining disconnected from his own immediate emotional wounds. Another may channel pent-up anger into sports competitions or games, experiencing disproportionate emotional intensity in these controlled contexts. Jung did not see these channelings as inherently negative, but he recognized their compensatory character when they functioned as substitutes for directly confronting the true sources of anger. The relationship with material objects can also reveal misplaced anger. Jung noted the phenomenon of objectified aggression, where emotionally broken men develop charged relationships with inanimate objects, treating them as repositories of frustration. They may slam doors, throw objects, or damage belongings in moments of frustration, or develop disproportionate irritability when objects do not work as expected. This transfer of anger into the material world represents a primitive form of displacement that allows for some emotional discharge while avoiding the perceived risk of direct interpersonal expression. Dreams of men with displaced anger often contain images of restrained explosions, caged or pressed animals, or scenarios where the dreamer observes violence without being able to intervene. Jung paid special attention to these dream symbols, considering them to be accurate representations of the state of repressed emotional energy. Particularly revealing are recurring dreams where the man tries to scream but no sound comes out. A perfect metaphor for the experience of anger that finds no authentic expression in waking life. 6. Extreme rigidity. Psychological flexibility, in the Jungian view, represents a fundamental capacity for mental health, the ability to adapt to life's changing circumstances while staying true to one's core values. However, Carl Jung observed that emotionally broken men often develop what he called compensatory rigidity, a psychological inflexibility that functions as a defense mechanism against perceived vulnerability. This rigidity is not merely a preference for structure or order, but an unconscious strategy for maintaining the illusion of control in an internal world that feels chaotic and threatening. The first sign of this extreme rigidity manifests itself through what Jung called behavioral hyperconsistency, an inflexible adherence to everyday routines and rituals, even when counterproductive or decontextualized. Men may follow exactly the same morning procedures, commuting routes, or eating habits, demonstrating disproportionate anxiety when these routines are disrupted. Jung observed that this behavioral rigidity often intensifies during periods of greater emotional stress, functioning as an illusory anchor of stability in the midst of internal turmoil. Rigidity is proportional to the fear of transformation, Jung wrote in his clinical observations. This insightful observation reveals how inflexibility functions as a protection against the natural process of psychic growth that necessarily involves destabilization and reorganization. The emotionally broken man develops what Jung called closed systems of thought, hermetically sealed cognitive structures that resist new information or perspectives. This cognitive rigidity manifests itself as dogmatism, binary, all or nothing, thinking, and intolerance of ambiguity, traits that Jung identified not as innate personality traits, but as defenses against the anxiety of confronting the complexity of human experience. Particularly revealing is the relationship with time that Jung observed in these men. He identified the phenomenon of chronorigidity, an inflexible relationship with schedules and deadlines that transcends simple punctuality and assumes a compulsive quality. Man may become overly concerned with temporal accuracy, experiencing disproportionate anxiety with minimal delays or schedule changes. This fixation on time control often reflects an unconscious attempt to contain the unpredictability of emotional life. As Jung noted, the less control man feels over his inner world, the more rigidly he will try to control the outer dimensions of his existence. In interpersonal communication, extreme rigidity manifests itself through what Jung called dialogical inflexibility, an inability to adapt perspectives or genuinely consider alternative viewpoints. Conversations with these men often follow predictable patterns where new information is immediately categorized within pre-existing thought structures, rather than potentially modifying them. This communicative rigidity creates a monological quality even in apparent dialogues. The man may seem engaged in the exchange, but internally remains impervious to transformative influences. In the moral and ethical realm, Jung observed the development of what he called compensatory hypermorality, a rigid code of conduct that does not allow for nuances or exceptions. The emotionally broken man often adopts absolutist moral positions, demonstrating intolerance of any deviation from his ethical expectations, both in himself and in others. This moral rigidity, paradoxically, often coexists with significant blind spots, areas where one's own behavior contradicts rigidly held principles. Jung saw this inconsistency not as simple hypocrisy, but as evidence of the internal fragmentation that rigidity desperately tries to contain. The relationship with one's own body also reveals extreme rigidity through what Jung identified as chronic, defensive posture, persistent patterns of muscle tension that literally stiffen the body against perceived threats. These men often have a restricted posture, limited movement, and shallow breathing, direct physical manifestations of Psychological constriction. Jung was a pioneer in recognizing how this body armor not only reflects but also perpetuates mental rigidity, creating a negative feedback loop where physical tension reinforces psychological inflexibility. In intimate relationships, rigidity manifests itself through what Jung called one-sided relational contracts, inflexible expectations about how relationships should work, often not explicitly communicated. Man can develop disproportionate reactions when these implicit expectations are not met, unable to adapt to the changing needs and realities of the relationship. This relational rigidity often coexists with a deep fear of abandonment, a contradiction that Jung saw as evidence of the internal conflict between the need for connection and the terror of vulnerability. Creativity and expression also suffer under extreme rigidity. Jung noted the phenomenon of stereotypical expression, where emotionally broken men develop highly predictable and limited modes of self-expression. They may repeat the same stories, consistently use the same phrases, or draw on a narrow repertoire of emotional responses. This expressive limitation reflects what Jung called the freezing of the authentic self, a process where vital parts of the personality are systematically suppressed to maintain the illusion of control and predictability. The dreams of these men often contain images of confinement, rigid structures that fail or break, or situations where the dreamer is paralyzed or unable to move. Jung considered these dream symbols to be direct communications from the unconscious about the psychic. Cost of extreme rigidity. Particularly significant are recurring dreams of seemingly solid structures suddenly collapsing, accurate representations of the fundamental fragility that rigidity desperately tries to hide, but which the unconscious clearly recognizes.